oftentimes we'll say things just to make people happy, and those people don't care about us as human beings. They don't care if we live or die. They only care if we're useful to them. It might be people who you care a lot about, and you might think very highly of them. They might be very important to you, but you're only important to them as long as you're useful to them. They don't care if you really think it, they just care if you say it. What happens if you say it? Well, then you end up like the tightrope walker. You realize that you lived a life, that you compromise yourself for people who didn't care if you lived or died. They didn't care if you were a human being. As far as they're concerned, you could have been an NPC. And yet, you molded your whole life to make them happy and to live by their standards, to follow their morality, to follow their ideas of what your future should look like. Either way, if you say things that you don't believe, you're going to suffer for it. If you say things that you believe, you're going to suffer for it. Stop me if you've heard this before. Life is suffering. You don't get to choose not to suffer, but you can choose what you're going to suffer for. And there's almost nothing probably in the universe that's worth suffering for more than what we know to be true. Truth is going to win out eventually. And that's what all of this is alignment. When the things that you say, think, and do are in alignment, that's what happiness is. And so happiness, in a certain sense, is truth. Truth is happiness, happiness is truth. And maybe we don't know what the truth is, but we can still express the truth as we best understand it. We can get as close to the truth as we possibly can, and then hold on to it. Stop me if you've heard this before, with a loose fist. In other words, hold on to what you believe to be true, but be willing to acknowledge that you don't know what you don't know, and maybe some new information comes along and you replace what you're holding on to with something else. And there's something really important at the beginning of what you said, that he's giving us a definition here. When you see the word is, most of the time, it's saying that whatever's on this side of the word is equal to what's on this side. So basically, an is can serve as the word is can serve as a equal sign. Like I have up here, A is A. You might say 2 plus 2 is 4. In other words, what's over here is equal to what's over there. So when you see the word is in sentences, think of it that way. A lot of times it's giving you an explanation of whatever's on the left side of that word. So here, Gandhi's giving us a definition of what happiness is. He's saying happiness is these things. When the things that you say and think and do are all in harmony. And so therefore, being unhappy is when those things are not in harmony. And you can see examples of this. So an example I used last period, I'm sure you can come up with better ones, but I was talking, I think last week, the week before last, that there will be people who will tell you that 2 plus 2 can equal 5. We all know, intuitively, this is just not true. This is a stupid thing. Now, people will pressure you to say it. They won't care if you actually believe it, but people will pressure you to acknowledge it. Say, this is true. So maybe you'll just say, fine, 2 plus 2 equals 5, just to get past it. But it's not what you think. And then if you walk into your math class after that, and you have a test, and you're asked what's 2 plus 2, you're going to say 4. So it isn't even in alignment with what you do. Or let's say you're an engineer and you're building bridges, or whatever your job is and it requires mathematics. You're going to do differently from the thing that you're saying, if this makes sense. And this is a really simple example. But now what happens is you've got this, we can equate this almost to Jung's persona and the shadow. This is the thing that you're saying is the thing that you're showing the world. And then these are the things that you're not showing the world, the things that you think, and maybe the world doesn't see the things that you do. Maybe they won't see you take the test, or see you at work doing mathematics. So there's a disunity now. This goes back to what you're saying about unity. There's a disunity here, where this does not equal these things over here. So you kind of have a really messed up math equation. And this is why people will be unhappy. This is one of those things that will cause anxiety disorders. It can cause depression. This is what Jung would say, because these things don't match up. It's like when your persona and your shadow don't match up. So you have to try to suppress one or the other. Well, this is what causes most mental illness, as Jung believed. But if you can get these things in alignment, if you can individuate, bring them together, well, now you have a whole person, and you no longer suffer from the anxieties. So Gandhi is essentially saying kind of the same thing as Jung with that. So now start thinking about the things that we say. And a lot of times we're forced to say things, maybe not even verbally, but like, what was it? There's a terrorist attack several years ago, and a bunch of people on Facebook changed their profile pictures to the French flag. You know, it's like, if you didn't do it, people were like, huh. I think 2 years ago, people changed their profile pictures on Instagram to just a black square, and people who didn't do that got chastised for it. What was the thing I was thinking of? Last period it came up. I'll think of it. But yeah, that's kind of the general gist here. So now start thinking about the things that you're going to say, think, and do. That if you don't do it, you're going to get yelled at. People online are going to dox you. People online are going to get pissed off at you. First off, it's online, whatever. But if it does matter to you, then now think about what some of those things are that you're pressured to say, things that you're forced to say, even if you don't really believe it. And the mobs, they don't really care if you believe it. They just care that you're going to say it. They don't care if you think it. They don't really even care if you apply it necessarily in your life. But this is the big one that they don't care about. They don't care if you think it. As long as you do what you're told to do, as long as you say what you're told to say. Who cares if you think it? And their whole thing is, this will eventually change if you just say and do what you're forced to do. Now the problem, of course, with that is that you're now going to realize that you're a compromised individual. You're going to realize that you've sacrificed your true self, your true beliefs, your true principles, your true values, and what you gain out of it. An outraged mob that just kind of says, okay, good for you. It wouldn't make sense in this class. I'm going to try anyway. My second period class is reading something different from what you guys are reading. They're reading Das Buch Zarathustra from Friedrich Nietzsche. They're reading the prologue to it. And it's a fascinating prologue. So long story short, it's about this guy who goes up in the mountains, Zarathustra. And he's up there for 10 years. And while he's up there, he gains a bunch of wisdom. And he decides, I'm going to go down from my mountaintop now, and I'm going to go preach my wisdom to the world. People need this wisdom. So on his way down, he encounters a monk. And the monk is asking him, hey, where are you going? I remember you. You walked up here a long time ago, but you look different. And he's like, yes, I gained wisdom. So he's glowing or whatever. So the monk is telling him, where are you going? I'm going to go tell the people my wisdom. The monk is telling him, don't bother, man. The people don't want your wisdom. Just stay up here in the mountains, hang out with the birds and the bears, and leave humanity alone. I don't care about humanity. But Zarathustra says, no, but I love mankind. I have to go down and spread this message. So he does. And he shows up at a town, the first town he comes across, and there's a crowd that's gathered. And they're gathered because there's going to be a show, a tightrope walker. Tightrope walkers? They walk on that tightrope, and if they fall, they die. So he shows up when this crowd is assembled, and he starts to preach his wisdom to them. Now, the crowd, first off, he delivers a really difficult message. He delivers some really hard messages to understand. The crowd is not his crowd. He didn't gather them. They didn't come to hear him. They came to watch the tightrope walker. So when he gets to the end of his message, they all kind of look at him, and they're like, oh, hey, man, we've heard enough. Let's see the tightrope walker. And they all start applauding. They didn't hear a single word the dude said. All that they heard was something about a hype. They thought that Zarathustra is the hype man for the tightrope walker. They didn't hear a single word of his message, of his wisdom. So Zarathustra gets upset about this. And then he delivers another message to them. And the same thing, they're like, oh, hey man, we heard you, but we've heard enough. Let's see the tightrope walker. So when they all start applauding. Then the tightrope walker hears the applause, and he thinks, oh, I guess that's my cue. So he goes out and he starts doing the show. Guess what happens to the tightrope walker? He falls and he dies. And when he falls and he dies, the crowd sees him, vroom. They see him land, and what's the crowd's reaction? I guess the show's over. The tightrope walker didn't matter to them for shit as a human being. He only mattered to them as long as they were useful to them. As soon as he wasn't useful to them to put on a show, they didn't care about him anymore. Zarathustra, however, goes over to the guy and comforts him as he's dying. And the guy is realizing with his dying moments, I put my whole life into learning how to do this and performing for people who didn't care if I lived or died. They didn't care about me at all. All they cared about was the show I provided. When you start to realize what's going on there, there's some things in your life that might start to make sense. Nietzsche believes that there's no such thing as good and evil, that good and evil are just words that we use to describe things that we don't like. He doesn't believe that there's any kind of like real morality. He doesn't believe there's such a thing as right and wrong. He believes in objective truth, like 2 + 2 = 5. But in terms of value judgments, he doesn't believe in any of that stuff. So this tightrope walker is dying, and he's realizing at the last moment, I lived my whole life to make people to make people happy. Those people don't care if I live or die. Basically, it was a wasted life. And Nietzsche's thing, and Zarathustra's thing is, at least you realize that now, before you die, so you can die with a bit of clarity and wisdom. Now, if you understand that, you understand what I'm talking about a little bit. That oftentimes we'll say things just to make people happy, and those people don't care about us as human beings. They don't care if we live or die. They only care if we're useful to them. And there are a lot of people in our lives that are like this, and realizing that is difficult because it might be people who you care a lot about. And you might think very highly of them. They might be very important to you, but you're only important to them as long as you're useful to them. And so this is kind of like what we're getting at here. People who will say this thing. If you don't say that thing, then they're going to turn against you. They don't really care if you believe it. They don't care if you really think it. They just care if you say it. Now, what happens if you say it? Well, then you end up like the tightrope walker. You realize that you lived a life compromised, that you compromised yourself for people who didn't care if you lived or died. They didn't care if you were a human being. As far as they're concerned, you could have been an NPC. They cared nothing about you, and yet you molded your whole life to make them happy and to live by their standards, to follow their morality, to follow their ideas of what your future should look like. And so you're going to suffer for that. What you could do is come along and say, no, 2 + 2 = 4. And by the way, this is a real conversation I witnessed in front of me. If you're telling me that 2 + 2 only ever equals 4, then you're a racist. That's a real conversation I watched happen in front of me. The person called the other one a racist and a transphobe. Does anybody see the connection between 2 + 2 = 4 and being a racist transphobe? There is no connection. I understand the connection that person's trying to make, but that person doesn't even believe it themselves. They're just using it for power. They're trying to force the other person to say what they want them to say. They knew the other person didn't believe it, but they didn't care if they believed it. They just wanted them to say it. That's all it was. It's a power move. So what happens if you don't say it? Well, you might get yelled at by a mob. You might get shouted down. You might get doxxed. You might get harassed online. And so therefore you're going to suffer. And then people will oftentimes say, oh, forget it. I'm just going to give into it. Who cares? I don't really believe it. Yeah, but now you're living a life that's not unified. You're living a life that's not in harmony. What you're saying is not what you actually believe. And therefore what you're going to do is not what you actually believe. And so you're going to suffer from, like Jung was talking about, this war between the persona and the shadow. You're going to suffer for something along those lines. Again, it's not literally the persona and shadow the way that Jung talks about it, but we can think of it that way as an analogy. And so think about a lot of the things that we just kind of say in life. I mean, I think about it just as a teacher. You know, are you guys paying attention right now? Yes. Are you though? You know, you have people who ask you questions like, well, why did you do that? I don't know. Well, you're saying I don't know, but you do know why you did it. You know, but why are you saying I don't know? Because if you just shut up and you stare at the person long enough, eventually they'll walk away. And that's the lesson that we sometimes learn when we're kids. Your parents ask you something and you just kind of go, I don't know. Now you do know, but eventually they'll walk away if you just say, I don't know, and you annoy them enough with that. But at some point it's time for us to grow up. And the question is going to be, are we going to carry that little kid behavior into adulthood, where we say things that we don't actually believe, where we say things that we're not actually doing? Now, I don't necessarily mean that, like if you're doing something bad in your life, you can still give good advice about it. Like a person who's in prison can tell you, hey, don't steal cars, because you're going to end up where I am. That person is not a hypocrite. A person who steals cars but pretends like they don't and then tells you not to do it, well, that's a hypocrite. A person who's telling you, hey, don't do drugs. They don't really believe that, and because they're doing the drugs themselves, but they're hiding it from you. That's a hypocrite. And of course, if you're a hypocrite, you're going to suffer because you're going to get found out eventually. And when you get found out eventually, you're going to be forced to face that reality that now people think that about you. They know that about you. And then, of course, they're going to treat you differently. They're going to behave differently towards you. And you'll have lost something that you previously had, which is trust. And so Either way, if you say things that you don't believe, you're going to suffer for it. If you say things that you believe, you're going to suffer for it. Stop me if you've heard this before. Life is suffering. You don't get to choose not to suffer, but you can choose what you're going to suffer for. And there's almost nothing probably in the universe that's worth suffering for more than what we know to be true, the truth. Because as we were saying a couple weeks back, truth is going to win out eventually. And that's what all of this is alignment. When the things that you say, think, and do are in alignment, that's what happiness is. And so happiness, in a certain sense, is truth. Truth is happiness, happiness is truth. It doesn't necessarily mean joy, because you say what you actually believe, and all of a sudden there's a mob of people chanting at you and doxing you and all that. You're not going to sit there and go, this is great. But what's the alternative? Eventually, we have to decide if we're going to be on the side of truth. And maybe we don't know what the truth is, but we can still express the truth as we best understand it. We can get as close to the truth as we possibly can. And then hold on to it, stop me if you've heard this before, with a loose fist. In other words, hold on to what you believe to be true, but be willing to acknowledge that you don't know what you don't know, and maybe some new information comes along and you replace what you're holding on to with something else. It's important to be able to do that because we don't have all truth. But as long as you're in alignment with the truth, then what do you have to worry about? You don't have to worry about getting found out about anything. You don't have to worry about being a hypocrite. You don't have to worry about, well, in some cases, you have to worry about what your children think. It's interesting to think about that sometimes, isn't it? Think about the things that you hide from your parents. Think about the kinds of things your parents hide from you. Because if you're hiding things, guess what? It's human nature to hide things. And that means that they're hiding things from you too. So you should judge them very harshly for it. Right? No, because the truth is that someday you will be hiding things from your children too. You know those things that you're doing right now that you wouldn't want your kids to do? That you're hiding from your parents? You're going to have to hide those things from your kids someday too, the fact that you did them. Or, worse yet, you can come along and tell your kids that you did do them. And then you're going to believe that that doesn't make your children feel like they have a license to do it themselves. They get caught doing it. It's like, well, dude, Mom, Dad, you told me you did this too. There's no way out of that. Do you hide from them? Do you tell them the truth? They're both going to be bad options as far as their development's concerned. So maybe it's better to not do those things in the first place. It's hard though. It's difficult, of course, but stop me if you've heard this before. Life is suffering. What are we going to suffer for? So, Gandhi would say, you want to be happy? Get those things in alignment. Say what you actually believe. And then do the things that you actually believe. And do the things that you say. Say the things that you're going to do. Keep them all in alignment. Questions, comments, concerns, complaints, criticisms, critiques?